In 1239, the King of France wrote the single largest check of his reign. Not for an army, not for a cathedral, for a ring of dried thorns. He paid 135,000 livres, roughly half of everything his kingdom earned in a year, to buy the crown of thorns from a bankrupt emperor who had already pawned it to Venetian bankers. The holiest object in Christendom came off a pawnbroker's shelf. That is not devotion. That is a transaction. And here is the part that should stop you cold. When Louis got the crown home, he built a chapel to hold it, the Sainte-Chapelle, a jewel box of stained glass that still stuns tourists today. That building cost him a fraction of what the relic inside it did. Sit with that for a second. The container was cheaper than the thorns. The real estate was cheaper than the bone. In this economy, a dead man's leftovers were the most valuable thing a king could own. So today I want to take you inside that economy. Not to laugh at the people who knelt and prayed their faith was real, and we are going to keep that in view the whole way through. I want to show you the machine that grew up around that faith. Because underneath the incense and the gold, there was an invoice. And once you learn to read it, you will never look at a jeweled box in a museum the same way again. Let me show you the ledger. Start with a simple question that nobody in the year 1100 would have found strange. What is a bone worth? Not a symbol, not a memory, a price. Because in medieval Christendom, the physical remains of a holy person, a saint, were believed to be soaked in power. Not a metaphor for power, actual working power. The saint was in heaven, close to God, and their body was the antenna that reached back down to earth. Touch it, pray beside it, and the saint might carry your request upstairs. Heal your child, break your fever, get you out of the fire waiting after death. Now, if you genuinely believe that, and millions did, with their whole hearts, then a saint's finger bone was not a keepsake. It was infrastructure. It was the single most useful object a community could possess. And the moment something is that useful, and that rare, a market forms around it whether anyone intends it to or not. That is the thesis, and I am going to be blunt about it. Relics were not sacred souvenirs locked safely away from the grubby world of money. They were assets. They generated revenue. They were fought over, stolen, split apart, priced, insured against theft, and marketed against the competition. Three things happen in a market like this. Somebody gets spectacularly rich. Somebody quietly runs the machine that makes them rich. And somebody, usually the person praying hardest, pays for all of it without ever seeing the books. Keep those three roles in your head. We are going to meet all of them. Here is the first thing you have to understand about the product, because it is genuinely clever. A relic sells something invisible. Grace, protection, a shortcut through the afterlife. You cannot put grace in a box, but you can put a bone in a box, and the bone stands in for the grace. That is the whole trick. The relic makes an invisible promise into a physical, ownable, transportable thing. And once it is a thing, it can be located. If the grace lives in that specific femur, in that specific church, then the grace has an address. And if it has an address, people have to travel to it. That is the engine. Hold on to it, because everything downstream runs on it. And demand for this engine was not left to chance, it was written into law. From the year 787, by decree of a great church council, no new church could be consecrated without a relic sealed into its altar. Read that again, because it is the quiet foundation under everything else. The church did not merely permit relics, it required them. Every single altar in Christendom, and thousands upon thousands of them were built across the medieval centuries, was, by canon law, obligated to contain a fragment of a holy body. That is a demand curve created by legislation. Imagine a law that said no shop could open its doors without a diamond bricked into the floor, and then look at what that would do to the price of diamonds. This is the same move. A fixed, tiny supply of actual dead saints, and a legal mandate manufacturing near infinite demand for their pieces. The market did not sneak up on the church by accident. The church wrote the demand into its own rulebook and then spent the next several centuries living with what it had unleashed. So how does a church actually turn a bone into income? Not by selling the bone. A working relic is worth far more kept than sold. You monetize the visit. You build a shrine, and you let the faithful come to it. And they come with offerings, coins left at the tomb, candles bought at the door, vows paid in silver when the miracle works. A busy shrine is a slow, steady drip of money that never stops, year after year, generation after generation, as long as the saint keeps his reputation. And the churches understood the mechanics of that reputation with a sophistication that is almost modern. Take Canterbury. In 1170, 4 knights walked into the cathedral and murdered the Archbishop, Thomas Becket, on the stone floor. Within a few years, Canterbury was not a crime scene. It was a destination, one of the 4 greatest pilgrim shrines in all of Christendom, ranked beside Jerusalem, beside Rome, beside Santiago de Compostela. A murder had been converted into a brand, and the monks ran that brand like operators. They took the cloth that had soaked up the archbishop's blood, and they mixed a trace of it into holy water, and they sold it in little tin ampules you could wear around your neck. They called it Canterbury Water, and pilgrims believed it could cure blindness, fever, madness, leprosy. Think about what that actually is. It is a branded, single-use consumer product bottled from a corpse, with a health claim on the label. Archaeologists have since dug up around 1,300 of the little pilgrim badges people bought at English shrines, and that is just the ones that survived in the mud. The souvenir trade alone was an economy. So that is layer 1. The shrine collects offerings from the crowd, but the crowd is the real prize. And to see why, you have to follow the money past the church door and out onto the road. Because a pilgrim is not a worshiper who materializes at the altar. A pilgrim is a traveler, and a traveler, on a journey of days or weeks, has to eat, sleep, change money, replace a worn-out shoe, hire a guide, pay a toll to cross a bridge, and buy a little something to prove they made it. Every one of those needs is a transaction, and every one of those transactions happens to someone who is not the church. Watch what this does to an entire region. A town with a great relic is a town with a permanent, self-refreshing crowd of people arriving with money in their pockets and a reason to spend it. The inns fill. The bakers sell out. The stables rent every horse. The money changers take their cut on every foreign coin. A minor monastery in the middle of nowhere, sitting on the right bones, could bend the roads of a whole region toward its front gate. There is a monastery called Conques, tucked into a gorge in the south of France, that shows the whole mechanism in miniature. Conques was nothing special, until it got its hands on the bones of a young martyr named Sainte-Foy. And I want to be careful with the word got, because the honest story is stranger than that. According to the monastery's own account, told for centuries with pride, a monk from Conques traveled to another town, spent years worming his way into that community's trust, and then stole the saint's relics and carried them home. Stop on that, because it sounds insane to us. They were proud of the theft. They wrote it down as a triumph. And Conques was not unique. This was so common in the Central Middle Ages that historians have a name for it, borrowed from the medieval sources themselves. Furta Sacra, holy theft. Between roughly the years 800 and 1100, monks robbed each other's churches for relics on a regular basis, and the robberies were celebrated rather than condemned. How do you celebrate a theft? With a beautiful piece of logic. The medieval mind reasoned that a saint was not a passive object. A saint had a will. And a powerful saint could not simply be stolen against his wishes if the relics left. It was because the saint chose to leave, because he wanted a more worthy home, a grander shrine, more devoted keepers. So the thief was not a thief. He was an instrument of the saint's own decision. Let that land, because it is one of the great pieces of spin in history. The theft was not the scandal. The theft was the marketing. A stolen saint was a saint who had personally endorsed his new address, and once a church had the bones, it did not quietly shelve them. It threw what was, in effect, a launch event. The ceremonial arrival of a saint's body, the translation they called it, the moving of the relics, was staged as a public festival, processions through the streets, feasting, every bell in the town ringing at once. People came from miles around to witness it, and that was precisely the point. A translation was an advertisement broadcast to an entire region. We have the saint now. The miracles happen here now. Come to us delivered through the only marketing channel a medieval town possessed. A gathered crowd that would walk home and tell the story to everyone they knew. The theft got you the saint. The translation sold him. Now, I want to be honest about the edges of this, because the neat version can go too far. Not every monastery was a den of relic thieves, and not every pilgrim was a mark being fleeced. Plenty of relics were given, inherited, or genuinely believed in by everyone in the chain, including the monks. The scholar who mapped this world, Patrick Geary, was careful to argue that these thefts made sense inside the medieval value system. They were not simply cynical crimes, they were acts a whole society had reasons to approve. So hold both things at once. The faith was sincere, and the incentives were ferocious. Those two truths do not cancel out. They are exactly why the machine could run so smoothly for so long. Nobody had to feel like a con artist for the con to work. And the incentives created a genuine supply problem. Demand for relics was effectively infinite. Every church wanted one, every new altar legally needed one, and the supply of actual dead saints was, obviously, fixed. So the market did what markets always do when demand outruns supply. It innovated. Relics got divided. A saint did not have to stay in one piece. An arm could go to one church, a jawbone to another, a scattering of finger bones to a dozen more. One body could seed shrines across a continent, and the theology conveniently held that the saint was fully present in every fragment, so a single tooth carried the same power as the whole skeleton. From a business standpoint, this is extraordinary. It is a product that can be subdivided infinitely without any of the pieces losing their value. And where there is infinite demand and divisible, unverifiable product, there is fraud. Of course there was fraud. The roads filled with relic mongers selling bones dug out of ordinary graves in Roman catacombs, rebranded as apostles and martyrs. So many pieces of the true cross circulated that a later critic sneered you could build a ship from them. And this got so out of hand that in 1215, the church itself had to step in. The Fourth Lateran Council passed a rule, you can still read it, banning the sale of relics outside their containers and demanding that any newly discovered relic be authenticated by Rome before anyone was allowed to venerate it. Read that as what it plainly is, a regulator, created because the supply chain was drowning in counterfeits. The church was not policing greed in the abstract. It was trying to protect the value of the genuine article, the way a mint protects a currency. Fakes debase the coin. So now you can see the full apparatus. The invisible promise, made physical in a bone. The bone, given an address, so the faithful must travel. The travel, spun off into a regional economy of inns and tolls and souvenirs. The supply, stretched by division and theft, and, at the margins, forgery until the whole thing needs a regulator to keep it from collapsing under its own fakes. Which brings us to the question that the beautiful reliquaries are designed to make you forget. In all of this, who actually captured the money? Here is where I have to puncture my own story, because the obvious answer is the wrong one. You have been picturing fat, gilded churches raking in the offerings, and yes, the great shrines did well. But the offerings left at the tomb were never the real prize. Do the arithmetic on a pilgrim. The coin they drop at the shrine is small, a few pennies, a candle, a vow. But the money they spend getting there and back, the weeks of lodging, the meals, the tolls, the guide, the fresh horse, the badge, dwarfs it, many times over. And almost none of that money touches the church that owns the relic. The relic is the anchor. But the margin spreads out across every innkeeper, every baker, every toll collector, every money changer, every stable hand and stall holder strung along the pilgrim road. The bone is the reason the crowd exists, but the crowd's spending pours into 1,000 secular pockets that the saint never sees. A cathedral could hold the most powerful relic in the kingdom and still watch the bulk of the wealth it generated flow straight past its walls into the town it created, and climb one level higher, because the biggest players understood this. The truly enormous relic wealth did not sit with parish priests collecting pennies. It moved with kings and emperors and merchant republics who treated the greatest relics as sovereign assets, collateral diplomacy, the crown jewels of legitimacy itself. Go back to that crown of thorns. Before Louis of France ever bought it, it was sitting in Venice, not in a chapel, but held by Venetian bankers as security against a loan the Emperor of Constantinople had taken out and could not repay. The most sacred object in the Christian world was a line item on a defaulted debt. It was collateral, and Venice is not an accident here. A generation earlier, in 1204, a crusade that was supposed to march on the Holy Land instead sacked Constantinople, the richest Christian city on earth, and stripped it of its relics on an industrial scale. Those relics were shipped west and scattered into the cathedrals and treasuries of Europe, where a great many of them still sit today. Walk into St. Mark's in Venice and look at the golden altar screen, the Pala d'Oro. It glitters with something like 1,300 pearls and hundreds of emeralds, sapphires, garnets, amethysts, much of it wealth that flowed from that sack. The holiest heist in history, and the loot is still bolted to an altar you can buy a ticket to see. So follow the margin to its real resting place, and it is not the pious kneeling pilgrim, and it is often not even the local church. It is the operators 1 and 2 levels up the towns, the merchant cities, the crowned heads, who understood that a relic was not a devotional object. It was a magnet for money, and they positioned themselves exactly where the money pooled. Now, no machine runs forever, and it is worth asking what could actually kill this one, because the threats tell you what the machine truly depended on. And it turns out the answer was never a shortage of bones. It was belief, and the trust that held the belief together. The first threat was fraud eating itself. A market flooded with fake true crosses and counterfeit saints does not just cheat individual buyers, it corrodes confidence in the whole category. Every exposed forgery makes the next pilgrim wonder if the bone he traveled 3 weeks to kiss is a sheep's rib. That is why the church tried to become a regulator in 1215. Trust was the actual product, and forgery was pollution in the water supply. The second threat was exposure from within the slow arrival of people willing to say the quiet part out loud. Over time, scholars and reformers began to tally the impossibilities. The multiple heads of the same saint venerated in different cities, the vials of milk, the forest's worth of true cross. Once you can count the duplicates, the spell weakens. You cannot unknow that a saint has 3 skulls. But the threat that finally broke the model was bigger than any single fake. It was a change in the theology of the marketplace itself. When the Reformation came in the 16th century, it did not just accuse individual relics of being frauds. It attacked the entire premise, the idea that grace could be attached to an object, located in a place, and accessed by a journey and a payment. Pull out that premise and the whole apparatus loses its foundation at once. Shrines were stripped. Reformers in England smashed and dismantled the great shrines, and Becket's tomb at Canterbury, that 400-year cash engine, was demolished and its treasure hauled away by the crown. The machine did not die because it ran out of relics. It died because a critical mass of people stopped believing that the relic was the thing. So who won and who paid? Zoom in, because the general answer hides the human one. Over the centuries, the machine ran. The winners were structural. The great shrine towns that grew fat on pilgrim traffic. The merchant cities like Venice that turned sacred loot into permanent wealth. The kings who bought legitimacy by the bushel. Those players walked away with cathedrals, treasuries, and a glow of holiness that money alone could never have purchased. And who paid? The person the whole system was pointed at. The ordinary believer, grieving, frightened, hopeful, who saved for months, walked for weeks on bad roads, spent what little they had on lodging and tolls and a tin ampule of reddish water, all to press their forehead against a jeweled box because they had been told, sincerely, that it might save the soul of someone they loved. That faith was real. The hope was real. And it was the fuel that every other player in the chain quietly ran on. I want to end where I promised I would, holding both truths at once, because the cheap version of this story is to sneer, and the sneer is a lie. The devotion was not stupid. In a world of plague and hunger and no medicine, the belief that a saint might reach down and intervene was not a scam someone fell for. It was one of the only forms of hope available. That hunger was sincere. And the machine that grew up around it, the shrines, the thefts, the divided bones, the branded water, the pawned crown, the sacked city, that machine was a mechanism. Both things are true at the same time, and they never stopped being true at the same time. That is the whole point. So, the next time you stand in a museum in front of one of those golden reliquaries glowing behind the glass, go ahead and feel the awe. It is doing exactly what it was built to do. Just know that you are also looking at something else. An asset, a magnet, an invoice, written in gold, for a promise no one could ever actually deliver, and paid, every time, by the person with the least to spare and the most to hope for. Look at the box. Then look for the ledger. It was always there. If that shifted how you see one object in a glass case, imagine what it does to the next one. Because this is a channel about exactly that, the money machine humming underneath the things we were taught not to question. Subscribe, and next time we will follow the coin into an even stranger market. The box is beautiful. The ledger is better.